Hello, welcome to another one of our bookshop's virtual events. It's a real honor to have the amazing author Peter Brown zooming in from across the Atlantic. This is a transatlantic event. Peter, where are you zooming from? Where's home?
I live in Maine, which is the northeasternmost of the 50 states in America.
Northeast
Kind
of
of
the
up, kind of up near Canada, actually.
top right hand corner.
That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, so the time difference won't be too bad. So it's 2 o'clock here. So what time is it where you are?
9 a.m.
Oh, you know
Yeah.
what? That's for some reason I was thinking you'd be in like San Francisco or something, and it could be like 1 o'clock in the morning or something. I don't know.
No, it's not too bad. I'd be up anyway, so I didn't have to get up earlier than usual for today. So that's helpful. That's always nice.
But well, listen, it's such a pleasure, and I mean you're a legend. I mean the Wild Robot has sort of it's got long legs, and it's a really popular book over this side. I assume it's massively popular in America as well.
Yeah, it's pretty popular here. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, listen, thank you all to the schools for joining us, and there's going to be a presentation shortly from Peter, and then a draw along. So please get paper, get pencils, and get ready for that. He's ready. And so without further ado, let me hand over to the brilliant Peter Brown.
All right. Thank you so much. It's really great to be with all of you today. I'm Peter Brown. I'm an author and an illustrator. I write stories, I draw pictures. That's my job. And I spend time talking to students and people like you, like I'm doing right now with all of you. I love my job. I get to spend my days imagining stories about robots in the wilderness. I get to spend my days drawing pictures of tigers going wild and running through the jungle. I have a lot of fun with my work, but my job is not easy. Making a children's book is a lot of work, whether it's a picture book or a novel like The Wild Robot. A lot of work goes into making these things. So I thought today I would talk to you a little bit about how I became an author and an illustrator in the first place, and then a little bit about how I made The Wild Robot. So I'm going to kind of walk you through that process. And yeah, at the end I'll do a drawing demonstration. So feel free to draw along with me. And then at the very end, we'll have some time for question and answer. And we have some questions that were sent in early, I think. So I'll get
Yes, we
to
are.
as many of those as we can. But for right now, I'd like to share my screen so I can do a little presentation here for you. So give me 1 second here. I'm gonna share. And all right. So hopefully you see a bunch of wild robot art, a big scene of wild robot art with Roz standing on these rocks. If you don't, please let me know. But I wanted to start at the very beginning, because I've been drawing pictures for fun as soon as I could pick up a pencil or a crayon or something, and so I thought I'd show you some of my early masterpieces, like this beauty right here. I I drew this when I was 5 years old. I call this a blue horsey with sunshine, and you can probably guess why. I drew a lot of horses when I was a kid because down the road from my house was a farm, and I liked drawing the things that I would see in my everyday life. And I saw a lot of horses in my everyday life, so I drew a lot of horses. I drew pictures of our dog, our family dog. I drew pictures of my mother. There she is. Isn't she beautiful?
That's brilliant.
Uh, yeah, I was 5 years old when I drew this too. I was better at drawing than I was at counting. If you look carefully, you might notice. I just want to say, in real life, my mother had 5 fingers on each of her hands, but I got a little carried away here and gave her 6 on one of her hands. But look at the dress. I think her dress turned out pretty good. Her dark, flowery dress, not too shabby for a 5-year-old. So, way to go, 5-year-old me. When I was a
Was
little
she was
older,
she was she pleased with it?
oh yeah, she loved it. In fact, yes, my mom loved this drawing, I think in particular, because she's had that dress, forever and ever. I think she still has that dress. Um, but yeah, so she loved whatever I drew, but I think this one in particular. When I was 6 years old, with a little help from my mom, I made my very first book, a little fun project I did called The Adventure of Me and My Dog Buffy. The yellow book cover is on the left side of the screen. The right side of the screen is like the title page, like the first page you come to when you open a book. Um, and this book was inspired by my dog when I was a kid. I had a dog. Our family had a dog named Buffy. And we see my drawing of Buffy out on a tree branch on the title page there on the right. The real dog in real life did not climb trees, which was very disappointing to me. It would have been pretty fun to have a tree climbing dog. But one of the great things about making stories is that something that cannot happen in real life, like a tree climbing dog, can happen in your story. And I figured that out with my first story. And I've been writing and illustrating books for fun ever since I made the adventure of me and my dog Buffy. I didn't just like making books, I liked reading books too. And some of my favorite books when I was a little kid are still pretty popular here in the States. I don't know if these books are as popular in the UK, but I grew up reading a series called Frog and Toad, which are like classic books in the US. I grew up reading a series about the Berenstain Bears. I really loved books with animal characters, you know. So when I was a kid, I'd go to the library and I would check out books with my favorite animal characters, but I'd also check out books about how to draw different kinds of animals because I really loved to draw and I wanted to be better at it. And that meant I needed to practice, right? And these books were a really good way of practicing. Drawing something like a horse is actually pretty difficult, but when you get a book that's all about drawing horses, it makes it easier. You know, it kind of breaks it down into step by step instructions and you follow along, drawing one line at a time. And when you're finished, you have a pretty nice looking drawing of a horse or a bird or an elephant or whatever it is that you're drawing that day. So I really use these kinds of books, and I had like sketchbooks with blank sheets of paper and pencils and pens and markers and all sorts of drawing materials. And I would practice drawing. And over the years, I got better at drawing. That's kind of how it works, you know? So if you remember one of the first slides I showed you today, I called it Blue Horsey with Sunshine. Well, about 10 years later, when I was a teenager, this is what my horsey drawings look like. I keep
Wow.
saying horsey. I call them horses now. When I was a kid, I called them horsies. Um, so my drawings were much better, right? I practiced and I got better at drawing horses. I'd go to the zoo and draw pictures of zoo animals. And by the time I finished, I was ready to kind of go to university. I knew I wanted to be some sort of an artist. So I went to university and I studied art. I studied drawing, painting, and illustration. When I was at my university, I took a class on children's books. It was all about how to write and illustrate a children's book. This is one of the illustrations I made for that class. And I really enjoyed this subject because I got to come up with my own art style. I got to come up with my own adventures and my own characters. And I was having so much fun that I realized I wanted to be a professional author and illustrator, which is great, but you can't just snap your fingers and make that happen. It took some time. I started sending my ideas for children's books out to publishing companies, and eventually I started getting my books published. Not all of these books were published in the UK, but these are most of the books that I've published in the United States. Some of them are in the UK. But I mostly want to talk to you about my very first novel for kids, The Wild Robot. Um, and actually, to talk to you about this book, I have to kind of back up a little bit and talk about one of my picture books, The Curious Garden, because I had the idea for The Wild Robot while I was working on this book right here, The Curious Garden. So, The Curious Garden is about a boy who lives in a gray, dreary city where there's no parks or gardens, and he decides to become a gardener. And he does a really good job, and he starts growing these little wild gardens all over the place. Other people get involved. And by the end of this story, that gray, dreary city has transformed into a beautiful kind of garden city, right? Well, this is the cover of the book here. And what we see here is basically a painting that I made. Here's, oh, sorry. Here, it's basically a painting that I made. I paint a picture with paints and brushes. I send it to the publishing company that I work with, you know. They take a picture of that painting and they print it on the cover of the book. And they add the title, they add my name at the bottom. Um, Now, I don't automatically know what I want an illustration to look like. You know, I don't just sit down and paint this picture. I have to plan it ahead of time. And I do that by making sketches, usually with pencil on paper, um, to kind of figure out. I probably did 30 or 40 different sketches as I tried to imagine all the different ways I could possibly illustrate the cover of this book. And I like this sketch best. So that's when I got out my paints and my brushes and I sat down and I painted this picture, which ended up on the cover of the book. Now, I don't automatically know. I mean, I don't just sketch and plan the cover of the book. I sketch and plan every page of every book. And for this book, I was sketching a lot of scenes like these, you know, kind of unusual scenes of natural things and unnatural things together, you might say, right? Like on the left side of the screen here, we see this old abandoned industrial building that's become overgrown with vines and weeds and wildflowers. And it was while I was imagining and sketching these types of scenes for The Curious Garden, that picture book, that for some reason I drew a picture of a robot in a tree in my sketchbook, which didn't have a whole lot to do with The Curious Garden, but it had something to do with those themes of natural things and unnatural things together. Like a robot seems like kind of an unnatural thing, and a tree seems like just about the most natural thing in the world. So you put those together, those kind of opposites together, as I did in this little sketch here, and it sort of seems like there's a story in there. I wanted to know more about this robot, but
Yeah.
I was working on the Curious Garden, so I had to put my robot drawing away, and I had to focus, Peter, stay focused, please. I kept writing and drawing and sketching and planning all the pages of this picture book. Eventually, I sat down and painted all the illustrations that you see when you pick up the finished published book. And then one day, The Curious Garden was published, and it was out at stores and libraries, right? But in my free time, when I wasn't working on The Curious Garden, I kept thinking about that robot. Funny questions began popping into my imagination and my mind, like questions like, why would a robot be in a tree in the first place? How would a robot react to the wilderness? What would a wild animal think of a robot? Imagine you're a fox and you're just kind of trotting through the woods one day, and all of a sudden you hear these loud stomping steps, and then a robot comes marching towards you through the forest, right? Like, you're probably going to be afraid of that robot. You're probably going to run away and wonder, what is that thing? Those are the types of thoughts that sort of took over my imagination, all because of this little drawing of a robot in a tree. I don't even know why I drew this picture, but I couldn't stop thinking about it, which is a good sign if you're an author and an illustrator. I was like obsessed with the idea of telling some sort of a robot nature story. The problem was I had more picture books to make, to write and illustrate. Each of my picture books takes almost a year of my life. And so I
Mm.
spent about 5 years writing and illustrating all these different books before I finally had time to get serious about this robot nature story idea. At that point, I began imagining more scenes of a robot out in the wilderness and sketching them in my sketchbook. I was just kind of having fun with this idea, playing around, seeing where it took me. Um, I started reading everything I could find about real life robots, robotics, artificial intelligence, computer programming. I was reading about nature, subjects like animal behavior and ecology. I was reading science fiction. I've always loved stories about the future, about space travel, about robots. So I thought, well, maybe I could learn a few things by reading really great works of science fiction. I was learning so much interesting stuff about real life, real world robots, about fictitious robots from stories, about nature, about the things that they have in common, surprisingly, and about, of course, about their many differences between the natural world and the sort of robotic world. I was learning so much interesting stuff about those subjects that I realized this story was not going to be another picture book. This was going to be my very first novel for kids. So I started reading great novels for kids. One of my favorites is called Hatchet by an author named Gary Paulson, which is about a boy who finds himself stranded in the wilderness and he has to figure out how to survive. And that got me thinking, well, maybe my robot nature story should actually be a robot survival story, the story of a robot struggling to survive deep in the heart of the wilderness. That sounds pretty exciting to me. In fact, I was a little worried somebody had already written a book just like that. So I went to the library and did some research, and it turns out nobody had written the kind of robot nature story, survival story I wanted to tell. And that's when I knew I had to make The Wild Robot, which all came down to this question I wanted to answer. The question was, what would an intelligent robot do alone in the wilderness? There's no people around, there's no other robots around, just one robot alone in the wilderness. What happens? Well, to answer that question, I invented a character, Roz the robot. And one of the first things I had to do was figure out, what does Roz look like? And I began sketching and these simple little designs in my sketchbook. And the truth is that robots can look like almost anything. Here are two famous robotic characters from the movies. On the left, we have C3PO. On the right, we have R2D2. Now, C3PO looks kind of like a person with a body and a head and arms and legs. R2D2 on the right looks kind of like a trash can, a rubbish bin on wheels. I love R2D2, but he does look a little bit like that. I went to actual laboratories and met with real scientists who were building real robots that looked like dogs. I saw real robots that looked like spiders, that looked like submarines. The truth is, a robot could look like just about anything, but I kept my design pretty simple. This is what I came up with for Roz the robot. And I did that on purpose. The idea that really excited me about this story was to imagine how a robot would adapt to life in the wilderness. Roz is going to have to do all sorts of outdoor activities like hiding in the weeds and climbing trees and running away from bears, maybe. It's a little hard to imagine a rubbish bin on wheels climbing a tree, but I could imagine this robot climbing trees and doing those types of outdoor activities. And so those are some of the thoughts that went into why I gave Roz this sort of simple design. I started thinking about the setting for the story, and I thought an island was perfect. Roz, the robot, is stuck on an island. She cannot leave. She has no choice but to figure out how to survive. But I really wanted Roz to experience as much nature as possible, including all four seasons, like winter. This island looks kind of tropical. You don't really find winter weather on a tropical island. So I thought, all right, in that case, the island and the story should not be in the tropics. It should be up north, maybe off the coast of Canada or Alaska, someplace where there will be all four seasons. There'll be a variety of trees and plants and terrain, dramatic weather. A rugged northern island seemed like the perfect setting for my robot nature survival story. All right. So I was getting to know the setting for my story. I was getting to know my main character, Roz the robot, but I thought I needed more characters. And yet the idea was that Roz was alone in the wilderness. So how could she be alone, but there's other characters around? Well, of course, there's going to be all sorts of wild animals out there in the wilderness, but so what? How is Roz going to have any sort of meaningful interactions with animals? Surely this robot cannot speak with animals. That sounds ridiculous. Or does it? And that got me thinking, well, wait a second. I bet Roz is, robots are very different from people, right? So I bet Roz doesn't need to eat food or breathe air or even sleep or close her eyes at all. And I started thinking, well, what would happen if Roz were to camouflage herself, cover herself in like mud and weeds and grasses and flowers? She could hide in the wilderness better than any person ever could. She could study the wild animals more closely than any person ever could. And maybe she could learn lessons that no person ever could. So this is an illustration from the book. Roz camouflages herself like this. She sits down in a meadow and just kind of disappears, just blends into the landscape. She sits there for weeks, maybe a month, never moves at all, never falls asleep, never closes her eyes. She sees every little thing that happens in that meadow for a whole month. And what happens is she begins to notice the same bird flies down to the same rock and sings the same song every morning. The same family of deer come grazing through that meadow every evening. After a while, Roz can predict what the animals are going to do and when they're going to do those things and why they're doing those things. Slowly but surely, all the little animal noises and movements kind of start making sense to Roz, and she ends up like decoding the animal language. And she can make a lot of their same noises and movements, and so Roz the robot learns to speak with the animals. And once she can have conversations with them, she can make friends, she can make a family even. But most important to me was that she could learn lessons from them because every animal is like an expert at a certain kind of survival. Beavers build dams, geese migrate south for the winter. Many animals can kind of camouflage themselves into the environment. I thought Roz could learn a whole lot about survival from all these animals who are experts at survival, including a little baby goose, a little gosling like this one. Isn't he adorable? It doesn't seem like a big, strong robot would have much to learn from a little gosling, right? But that's what happens in the story. Roz finds a little orphaned gosling who's got no family of his own. He hasn't even hatched from his egg yet. He She finds a goose egg on the forest floor and she picks it up and builds it a little nest. And this egg hatches. Here's a sketch of the scene from the book, from the illustration that I made. This egg hatches. This little gosling breaks out of his egg. The first thing he ever sees in his entire life is Roz the robot looking back at him. And he just figures this creature taking care of him must be his mother. So he calls her Mama. And Roz understands him, and she can't abandon him now. So she adopts this little gosling as her son and names him Brightbill. There he is a bit more grown up. And so Roz the robot and Brightbill the goose have an unusual but a really interesting little family together out there in the wilderness. Well, as you can imagine, I had a lot of ideas for the story. I was jotting things down in my sketchbook and my notebook and my computer, but there comes a point in the process where I have to decide what happens first in my story. What happens second? What happens third? What happens every little step of the way throughout the entire plot of my story? It can be kind of overwhelming because I have so many ideas. So I do this thing I call story mapping. A million things could happen. I just start writing down these little moments of that could possibly happen in my story. And I'll circle each little idea and I'll draw an arrow from one little moment to the next to the next. I can easily compare and contrast two possible moments that might happen in my story. Maybe I like one idea better than the other. So I cross off one and I keep going with the other. It's sort of a messy process to explain, but the idea is I'm getting all of my thoughts out of my head onto this page, onto these pages, because I do this over and over and over again. But gradually through this kind of messy process of rearranging my ideas and these thoughts and scenes from the story, I eventually figure out exactly what I want to happen in the plot of my story. And then I make an outline, a very detailed outline of every little moment from the beginning to the very end of the story. And then eventually I actually start to write the words that we might read in the finished book. So I type up my story in what's called a first draft, a first version of the story, and I send that off to the publisher that I work with. And they get back to me with their feedback, their comments about what I've written. Maybe they'll suggest I change a character's name. Maybe they correct bad grammar. I make mistakes too. Near the middle of the screen here, my editor at the publishing company, she's highlighted one sentence, one line there for me, and her comment to me is a single word. That word is cut with a question mark, which is her polite way of saying, Peter, I think you should get rid of this sentence. Please do it right now.
They're
And she
very
says all that.
polite, aren't they?
Yeah, it's pretty polite. I like that. It's nice. She's gentle. She has a nice, gentle touch. She might highlight an entire chapter and say, cut? Question mark? Which can kind of hurt if you like that chapter. But sometimes it's the right thing to do. If there's a whole chapter that's unnecessary, you've got to get rid of it, right? So I don't want to waste people's time. So sometimes you have to make those tough decisions. Well, I'm also an illustrator, and I wanted this book to have lots of illustrations throughout. So as I figured out the plot of the story, I began to imagine which scenes I wanted to illustrate. I have to kind of pick and choose which moments I'm going to illustrate. So here's some of the sketches I made for illustrations that I'll show you later. This is not the finished art. This is just my plan for an illustration that I'll make later. This is one of the very opening scenes in the book. There's a big storm scene in the story. There's a lot of animal characters. I spent a lot of time sketching animals. Um, a book cover makes a big difference. A good book cover will make somebody walk across the room and pick up that book to check it out because it looks interesting. That is what you want to happen. So you cannot rush the design of your cover. Here are a couple sketches I was playing around with for the cover of the book that I didn't end up going with, but they kind of helped me figure out the eventual design that I settled on. All right, so I sketch every scene from the whole book that I want to eventually illustrate. I send those sketches to the publishing company, and they start building this file in their computer that looks kind of like a book. Here you can see it says chapter 4, the robot hatches. There's 2 paragraphs, and then there's a little number 8 underneath there because it's page 8 of the book. The facing page, page 9, is that sketch, which we'll replace with art, finished art a little later. And down below is chapter 5. So what we see here is all of chapter 4. It's only 2 paragraphs long. It's a pretty short chapter. All right, I want to talk to you about how I made the illustration for the cover of the book. Here's my desk where I work. You can see there's some paintbrushes and a bucket of water. The water's kind of dirty because I've been cleaning my brushes off in it, and because I've been painting with black ink. You see there's a piece of paper on the desk. It's white paper with these black splotchy marks on it. The cover art for the wild robot is in full color when you pick up the finished book, but it starts off as just simple black shapes that I paint on white pieces of paper. I painted a lot of pages like this, just a whole bunch of tall triangles. Pretty simple stuff. But you put all these tall triangles together and it starts looking a little bit like maybe a forest of, evergreen trees or maybe mountains. We're not really sure yet. But later on, I'm going to use my computer to kind of collage simple shapes together. But this is how it starts. Just painting simple shapes on pieces of paper. Some of the pages I painted look like this. They're sort of inky, blobby shapes. Some of the details I might draw with pencil on paper. Simple shapes like trees and grasses and twigs. So I end up with all of these very simple little drawings and paintings on paper, which I then scan into my computer using a scanner, like a fancy camera. And then I can start working with those little drawings and paintings in my computer, starting with this gray rectangle in the background. That'll be our background. I'll lay some shapes over top of that. Those are some black, inky, blobby shapes, but these look like clouds when you turn them white. Okay. Here's a squiggly circle up in the upper right-hand corner. That's actually the sun in the sky. We'll come back to that in a second. It's kind of hard to see at the moment. The dark area at the bottom is water. Doesn't really look like water, but I'll add a layer of little wavy pencil lines, and now that's starting to look like water at the bottom. Here's a big layer of tall triangles. We're not really sure what those are. Those could be mountains, they could be trees, but I'll add another layer of forest details. And now it's starting to look kind of like some sort of a pine tree forest. Here's a big layer of rocky shapes. I painted all those rocks individually, but I just put them on one slide to speed things up here. And then and then here's Roz. Now Roz is on one slide also, but she's made up of simple shapes, circles for eyes and hands, kind of a half circle for her body, sort of a rectangle for her head. And I put them together to look like Roz. And there's the title and my name at the bottom. I usually don't worry about the color till the end. Once every shape is in just the right place, I can select it in my computer and change its color, and I played around until it looked like this. So that's the finished front cover of the book. However, I don't just think about the front cover. I think about the whole book jacket that wraps around the book and kind of tucks into the pages on the hardcover. In America, we have a hardcover version, which has this full wraparound jacket. You do things sometimes a little differently in the UK, but this is part of my process. And here's the art just by itself. Um, so using that same process, I make finished art based on all of the sketches. You saw this sketch earlier. Well, there's the finished illustration I made based on that sketch. Here's some more finished illustrations. There's Roz riding on the back of a grizzly bear with her son Bright Bill on the shoulders. You know, the problem with adopting a goose for a son is that they have instincts that tell them to fly south for winter. Roz is stuck on the island, but her son is not. And so they have to say goodbye at a certain point. She realizes she has to let her son follow his natural instincts. And so she climbs to the top of this old tree and watches as all the geese fly south together, including her son, Brightbill. All right, so I finish all the art. I send all the finished illustrations to the publisher. They go through this file we saw earlier, replacing the sketches with the finished illustrations throughout the whole book. We get all the pictures just right. All the words are just right. My job is done. The book is ready to be printed. So they send this computer file to a printing press, which is like a factory that makes books. And sometimes they make my books. And now you know a little bit about how and why I made The Wild Robot, and it all started with a drawing of a robot in a tree. Now, if you read The Wild Robot and you enjoy it, there's a sequel called The Wild Robot Escapes, and then the third book came out last year called The Wild Robot Protects. So there's a whole trilogy of Wild Robot books waiting for you if you're interested. I hope you give them a shot. And there's even more Wild Robot stuff because yes, there is a movie, the Wild Robot movie. I think is just about to come out in the UK. It's been out here in the States for a couple of weeks now. It was the number one movie in America for the first week it was out. Right now, it's the number one movie in the whole world, which is kind of hard to believe. So it's doing very well. I hope you guys will go check out the movie. There's if you haven't already, there's like movie trailers. You know, you can go onto YouTube or something and watch the Wild Robot movie trailer. There's several of them. I was hoping to play one for you today, but I couldn't quite figure it out, so I apologize about that. But you know, I just want to talk to you a little bit about my experience real quick with the movie. I the director of the movie, his name is Chris Sanders. He and I had many conversations over the course of the filmmaking process, and eventually the movie was finished and it came out. And so I want to talk to you real quick about some of the movie is very much like the book, but there are some differences. Let's look at the Roz in the movie versus the Roz in the book. There's a little difference, right? They're pretty similar, all things considered. They both have rounded bodies, long legs, long arms with rounded hands, a rounded head with two round eyes, glowing eyes, All things considered, they actually, I think, look pretty similar. The biggest difference between them is their neck, right? And I talked to Chris Sanders, the director, and some of the filmmakers about this when they were designing the movie version of Roz, because they told me that in the movie there wasn't going to be a whole lot of talking. It's out in the wilderness. There's a lot of quiet scenes out in nature and adventurous scenes out in nature, but there'd be less talking than in most movies. And so Roz, the robot in the movie, was going to have to be able to express herself and communicate with her body, which I thought was very cool. And in order for that to really work, for her to be able to use her body language, they needed her head to be able to like do stuff. And my version of Roz on the left didn't really allow for a lot of kind of head movement. And so they had to kind of redesign her head and her neck to allow her to be able to be a little more expressive with her head. And I thought that made perfect sense. And so they had my blessing. Not that they needed it, but they had my blessing to design Roz the way that they did. And the story is very similar too, but there are some differences in the story as well. So my dream is that people will read the book and then go watch the movie and then go back and have a conversation about the similarities and some of the differences between the two. The big ideas and the big themes are the same, but some of the details are a little different, and it can be kind of fun to think about maybe why some of those changes were made. Well, the movie came out here. a couple of weeks ago, but the world premiere of the movie happened at the Toronto International Film Festival back in early September. So I got to walk the red carpet with a bunch of movie stars. There I am on the far right, at the premiere of the movie. And if you look carefully, you might notice that I am standing next to Luke Skywalker.
You are.
Yeah, Luke
Mark
Skywalker,
Hamill.
who's actually an actor named Mark Hamill. Yeah, well, one of my heroes. I mean, the Star Wars movies might be the reason why I wanted to write science fiction in the first place, you know. So meeting Mark Hamill was really a treat. And some of the other actors, like Catherine O'Hara, is one of my favorites. The guy in the middle with the shiny jacket, he's Chris Sanders. He's the director of the movie. He's the one who's kind of in charge of the whole thing. And he's directed some great movies like the How to Train Your Dragon movies. He's directed Lilo and Stitch, which is another one of my favorite animated movies. So he's a pretty big deal in the world of animated movies. After Toronto, I went to New York and I had to go to Times Square, this big intersection in the middle of New York City where they have these giant billboards. And there I am at the bottom holding my little baby boy, Calvin, who's only 8 months old at that point. And there's those billboards behind me for the Wild Robot, which is pretty cool. The one on top was actually animated, so as you're standing there, like all sorts of stuff is happening. You can't see that in this still picture, but it was quite a scene there. So that was pretty special. Um, and one other thing we do, you know, what happens a lot when a movie comes out based on a book is they make what's called like the media tie-in or the movie tie-in edition of the book. And so now there's two versions of the Wild Robot out in the world for sale. On the left is the original version, on the right is the movie version. They're the same story with the same words and illustrations on the interior pages. The cover is different, as you can see. The hope is that somebody might watch the movie and really love it, and then maybe go to a bookstore or library and see the movie version of the book and be like, "Oh yeah, I love that movie. I think I'll read this book." That's what we hope happens. So real quick, I just want to mention a couple more things, and then we'll move on to the drawing demonstration. But there's even more Wild Robot stuff coming down the pipeline because next year I have a picture book, a Wild Robot picture book coming out called The Wild Robot on the Island, which was a really fun project for me to make to kind of bring Roz and Brightbill's world and life on the island kind of to life, I guess you'd say, in like full color, detailed illustrations. You know, I really pushed myself to do interesting things with the color because the interior illustrations in the novels are all in black and white, which is beautiful in its own way. But I thought this was a chance for me to kind of really have fun with color. And so you get to see some scenes that might look a little familiar from a novel. And there's Bright Bill hatching from his egg. And then there'll be some scenes that are a little less familiar, you know. And so I had a lot of fun playing with the seasons and the colors. And so I really hope you'll check out The Wild Robot on the Island when it comes out next year. So, all right, enough with this slideshow. Let me, hello again. Hopefully you see me in the middle of your screen now. I feel like drawing a picture. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to draw a picture of Roz running through the wilderness. And if you feel like joining me, that would be great. So kind of walk you through how I do this. Oh, my markers are over here. That's right. Now, I am a bit of a planner, you might say. I like to plan things ahead of time to make sure everything is going to work properly. So I even do that when I do drawing demonstrations in front of people like I'm doing right now, or I'm about to. So I start my drawing with a light gray marker to kind of sketch my scene and make sure everything will fit on the page. And then I go over it with a darker line, you know, kind of trace over it. So if you're drawing along with me and maybe you have a pencil, I would suggest you start by pressing lightly on the pencil to create light marks on your page. And then once we know everything will fit on the page, you can press it on your pencil harder to create darker lines. And I'll tell you when to do that. And if you're working with a pen or marker, you know, just do your best. That's all good. So I'm going to start by drawing some simple shapes because Roz's body is kind of a half circle. I'm drawing my version of Roz from the book. Obviously, there's this kind of new movie version of her, which we could draw, but honestly, I haven't ever drawn that version of Roz. So I'm going to do what I know. And that's the one from the book. So I draw kind of a half circle near the middle of the page. That's Roz's body, her kind of torso. Her head is like a rectangle that sits on top of her torso here. This will be maybe from kind of early in the in Roz's story. And she's still kind of robotic. Over the course of the story, she begins acting a bit more naturalistic, you might say. But we'll have her arms hanging straight down. She's kind of stiff and robotic. All right, those are her arms. Her hands are really just these circly shapes at the ends of her arms. We'll have her running. She's got these long, skinny legs that stretch forward like this. Her foot is like a little rectangle. at the end of her leg. So one leg is stretching forward, her other leg is going to be swinging back like this. I know you might not be able to see what I'm drawing super well. I apologize, but this is an important part of the process to just to make sure everything will fit on the page. And if I make a mistake when I'm drawing with light gray marker, it won't really show up when the drawing is all finished. All right, I'm going to draw some rocks on the ground. Roz is out in the wilderness. There's rocks and plants and stuff. And so I just draw these kind of lumpy shapes on the ground. Those are rocks. And then I'm going to put a circle up here, which is the sun in the sky. Okay. Okay, now I know where everything is going to go. So I can put my light gray marker away and grab my black marker, and I'll trace over this sketch. And now you'll be able to see much better. This part of the process is actually pretty easy. If you've sketched out everything properly, then the tracing part is pretty straightforward. So I just kind of go one line at a time, taking my time. There's no hurry. Although I don't really mind if the lines are a little wobbly. You know, as I'm drawing Roz, actually, I kind of like it if the lines are a little imperfect. You know, life in the wilderness is not easy for Roz. In the first book, she falls out of trees. She gets stuck in storms. She gets attacked by bears. And every time one of those things happens, she gets more scrapes and scratches, you know. So as I'm drawing Roz, I don't mind if the lines are a little wobbly because it gives the idea that she's no longer a brand new shiny robot. All right. Roz's eyes are basically just two circles, which sounds easy, but drawing circles can actually be kind of tricky. That's good enough. I'll outline the rocks below her. She's hopping over these rocks. Okay. One thing I love to do when I draw characters running outside is you just put a few little dots behind their feet like this, and suddenly it looks like they're kicking up dirt as they run. It is so easy, but it adds a lot of energy to the drawing, actually. It's kind of amazing. So I'm going to do some shading. Shading is all about shadows. And you can't really draw shadows unless you know where the light is coming from in your scene. Well, here's a circle for the sun. So the sunlight must be moving this way across the scene. And that helps me figure out where the shadows should go. So I just do some little simple gray marks here and there to kind of indicate that there's a light side of Roz and a darker side from the sunlight to the shadowy side. Takes a little practice. You know, I think like Roz's arms and legs are kind of tube shaped. So I think if a tube is bending this way and the light is coming from this angle, where would the shadowy side be? Well, it would be the underside, of course, here. And so you just add a little indication of shadows and starts making Roz feel a little more like a kind of a three-dimensional character. It's very simple, but it's kind of helpful. I'll do some shading on the rocks real quick. Just these little lines here and there. Makes them feel like they've got a light side and a shadowy side. The rocks probably have a rough surface, so I'll go back and add some little marks here and there, just these little dots and lines, just to kind of give the idea that there's a texture to them. Okay, I'm going to add some color. So I'll grab a green marker. You might not have color if that's fine. Just to use what you got. And I just draw these little lines on the ground. Very simple. There's grass, there's weeds, plants growing. I just put these little green lines here and there to give the idea that Roz is somewhere out in the wilderness. I'll add some leafy plants here and there. Maybe there's one right here. All right, now I want to draw a tree. Some of my trees are just tall green triangles, but this is going to be a straight line for my tree trunk. Straight as I can do it anyway. That's my tree trunk. Very simple, nothing special here. And then I draw these branches that are these kind of curving lines. And we've got ourselves a simple little evergreen tree. Simple is good. You know, you put a bunch of simple things together like I'm doing here, and it can start to look kind of interesting, actually. So I try not to overcomplicate things. I like to use simple designs, simple shapes, simple colors, preferably. Okay, let's see. I'm going to add a few more details with my black marker, just to add some contrast. Makes it a little more interesting. And then I've got one color left, which is probably my favorite color of all, and that color is pink. I love pink. Pink is beautiful by itself, but what I love most about pink is the effect that it has on other colors, especially green. If you put pink near green, it actually makes green look greener, which is kind of cool when you think about it. That one color can help another color be even more itself. I love that. A lot of my stories take place out in nature with greenery. So I had pink details, like a pink sun in the sky, and the whole thing looks a lot more interesting. And then I'll keep going. I'll add these little pink dots on the ground. Like maybe there's little wildflowers growing, and it just makes everything look a little nicer. And then I sign my drawing. My name is Peter Brown, but I'll sign my name in pink here. And that's how you draw Roz running through the wilderness. One line at a time. Pretty simple, but not too bad.
We can all sign our pictures, yeah.
Yes, don't write Peter Brown on your drawing. Write your own name on your drawing. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. How'd it go? Did you draw along, Ben?
I did. I did. I'll show you mine in a second. Shall I? Hang on. Let's. Da-da-da. Great reveal. Oh,
Oh yeah. Look at that.
come
Nailed it.
on.
Love it. That's great.
I was
Beautiful.
when you were doing the lighter lines, I was trying to keep up with that, but actually there was no need, was there? I was getting. I think I'm falling behind here.
That's okay. I know I overcomplicate things with my sketch phase of the drawing, but it really helps me. In all honesty, uh, when I'm drawing, this is kind of how it works. So I thought I'd share that with everybody. But I think your drawing turned out really well. So nice job.
I'll tell you. Unfortunately, I went to art school. You may not know, but from that, based on that talent. But I do. One thing I would say. I mean, I know we're going to move on to questions, but the when your drawings of the horses earlier, which you showed earlier on, incredibly accomplished. How does an artist like you decide on a design style that you're going to stick to when you're producing a book like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm capable of drawing more complex art than this.
Absolutely.
But this is fun for me, first of all. The other thing I wanted to do was I wanted the art in the Wild Robot books to uh, sort of set the mood for the story. They weren't necessarily meant to convey a lot of really important information, but more to kind of reflect what's happening in the text of the story. So I thought if the art became too complicated, I don't know, people might spend almost too much time on the art. I wanted them to kind of read the words and then look at the picture and have it and get a sense of how I envision the story, but not for it to kind of dominate things. The words were the focus for me. And so I thought a simpler art style would kind of make sense. And then people wouldn't dwell on the art for too long. And then they wouldn't interrupt the flow of the reading too much. Um, if the same story had been illustrated with incredibly detailed art, you might read the words and then spend a couple of minutes looking at the artwork and then kind of lose track of where you were in the story. So I
Mm.
thought maybe I'll just keep the art kind of simple. So you take a nice glance at it, you look at it, and hopefully you like it, but you don't sit around too long looking at it, and you stay focused on the actual story, the
Yeah,
storyline
yeah,
itself.
yeah. Brilliant. Well, listen, let's do some questions. I've had some pre-submitted questions from some of the children. Those who are watching live, please put a question in. And if you're watching the premiere that we're going to do after half term, do submit the questions on social media. I think we can do that, and I'll somehow get the questions through to Peter, and maybe we can have some kind of answer session somehow. I don't know how we'll do that, but first question, uncredited, sadly, but this is a great one. What were the robots going to be used for? Where was the skip taking them? Where were they being taken?
Right. So hopefully, I don't know how much if everybody watching has read the book or not. I don't want to give too much away, but I'll
You
just
can lay
say
the, you
that
can you can lay the scene at the start, the way that
yeah, this happens pretty early in the story, so I'm not giving a whole lot away. But there's a ship. Just like right now, as we're talking, there are these giant cargo ships sailing across the Atlantic Ocean, loaded up with big boxes and crates filled with televisions and microwave ovens and that kind of thing. I think in the future, there will be giant cargo ships sailing across the ocean, loaded up with robots. And so, in the very beginning, the very first scene of the story, a ship is sailing and it sinks. It's caught up in a big hurricane, big storm, sinks to the ocean, and all these crates float on the ocean. Most of them sink to the bottom of the ocean, but a few of them continue on the ocean currents and end up crashing onto the shore of this island. And that's how Roz gets to the island in the very first chapter of the book. But Roz wasn't supposed to be on the island, you know? She was on that ship. That ship was going somewhere. So the question is, where was it going, and what were these robots supposed to do? They, in my mind, these robots were designed to do all different types of what you might call manual labor, like anything from gardening to building a house to walking the dog to maybe even babysitting. I pictured these as very advanced robots that were capable of helping humans, people, in a variety of ways. So you might have one at your house, and it might, for you, cook dinner. Somebody else might have one at their house, but instead they use their Rosum robot to uh, take care of the garden or so, and probably they use it to do a whole bunch of different things. But that's kind of my vision. And so Roz wasn't meant to be on the island, but she gets there and she has sort of this simple programming to do certain kind of everyday activities. And now she's stuck in this wild place trying to make sense of it with very limited. I mean, she can learn. That's the biggest thing, is that she can learn. That ends up saving the day. But she's not built to survive in the wilderness, and so she has to do a lot of learning.
Yeah. That's wonderful, wonderful. So Joseph asks, which is a question that was going through my mind. Why did you choose the name Roz for the robot?
So Roz, her full name is Rosum 7134. She has those numbers at the end to kind of indicate that there's many thousands of robots just like her in the world. Maybe 10,000, who knows, maybe a million, but there's at least 7,134 Rosum robots in the world. Um, and I settled on the name Rosum for that type of robot as a little tribute to the very first robot story ever told. In my kind of research for while I was working on the Wild Robot, I read a lot of science fiction, including the first robot story of all time. It was a play that was performed in theaters over 100 years ago, and the play was called Rossum's Universal Robots, about a guy named Mr. Rossum who had a factory that built robots. And as a little tribute to that very first robot story, that was the first time the word robot was ever used in popular culture. And so, as a little tribute to that story, I decided to name these robots after Rossum, but I switched it from Rossum, like it is in the play, to Rozzum, because it sounded a little bit more robot-y, Rossum with a Z sounded pretty good to me. So that's how I ended up with Rossum, and then we shortened that for Roz. She says you can call me Roz. So that's how we got to the name Roz.
Nice, nice. We've only got 2 or 3 minutes left, so let's rattle through these questions. Who is your favorite character in Wild Robot? Again, I haven't got a good name for whoever asked that question.
Well, the whole thing kind of revolves around Roz, so I guess she would have to be my favorite. Although I do love some of the other characters. Bright Bill the goose is very important. Fink the fox is great. Chit Chat the squirrel is very popular with young readers. So there's a few great ones, I think. Ones that I love a whole lot. But Roz is she's the star for sure.
You can see a message on the chat. So, were the names of the animals and birds chosen for a particular reason? And that's from Cole.
I tried to think of how the animals would name themselves. Roz learns to speak with the animals, and so she starts to get to know what they call themselves. They give each other names, right? And so I thought, well, an animal like a goose, that's usually part of a flock where there's a bunch of geese all together. Maybe they would name each other after, I don't know, physical characteristics, right? So you get a character named Brightbill or Longneck or Loudwing, that kind of a thing. Animals that maybe live in smaller groups or not, or live by themselves, like bears, might name themselves after something tough that they find in their environment, like a nettle or a thorn. And so I just try to come up with a little system for every species of animal and how they might name themselves.
Just had a comment from 3T at Turnfell on Bright Bill is our favourite in the book. Whilst we're thinking of that, actually, someone from 3T, Daisy at 3T, and Elijah in 4T both turned furlong. They went to a special preview of the movie
Mm.
yesterday or somewhere, just a day or two ago. So it's obviously having little special previews around England at the moment.
Yes, that's what I hear. Yeah, it's exciting. It's happening. It's coming out.
I should have asked. I should have asked Daisy and Elijah to submit a review to us so we could review the movie. But this was a really lovely question. I think maybe we'll go with this. If you could have written in one book in history or made up one character from a book, which one would it be?
Hmm. Wow. Well, there's a book. I don't know. I don't know if this is popular in the UK or not, but one of the most famous of all time books for children in America is called Charlotte's Web, about a spider named Charlotte who gets to know a pig on a farm, and they have this really special friendship. It's a really incredible story, and it's kind of got this classic, timeless quality. And I read it, I've read it many times, but I reread it before I started writing The Wild Robot because I wanted to capture a little bit of that timelessness, that kind of that's a story that will work forever, that people could be reading in 50 years from now. That's what I tried to do with The Wild Robot. And a lot of my inspiration came from Charlotte's Web. So I guess that would probably be, if I could have, I would have loved to have written such an incredible book like that.
Fantastic. We've just officially had the review from Elijah, and he said the film was great. So,
Nice, good. I
very
think it
good.
turned out pretty well. Yeah, it's beautiful. I think people should definitely check it out. It's a gorgeous, visually stunning movie, and it's yeah, it'll make you feel a lot of strong emotions. My hope with the books was that they would make people laugh and maybe even cry at certain parts of the story, and the movie does that as well. So I was pretty
Uh,
happy that they kept that sort of tone.
has your relationship with the book changed over having the film? There's one particular question saying the favorite part. What's your favorite part of the book, and is that mirrored in the favorite part of the film as well?
Well, my favorite part of the book is probably when Roz meets Bright Bill when she finds this goose egg and decides that she's got to care for it. And that scene is absolutely it's handled a little differently, but it's basically pretty similar to what I do in the book. It's a very powerful moment in both the book and in the movie. Uh, and so that's one of the scenes that definitely kind of carried over. Not all of them did. They had to make some changes. You know, a movie is actually a fairly short story. 90 minutes to tell them for a movie is, you know, you gotta put a lot in there. And so and you have to make some tough decisions if you're the filmmaker. And so they had to kind of, you know, cut anything that wasn't essential to the story, they sort of had to maybe get rid of some characters, some scenes. And so it's a little hard for me, of course, as the author to see that happen, but I understand that it's a different medium. Art, it's a different art form. Film is a different art form. And so some of those changes are necessary. And so I understand.
Good. Listen, I can't even imagine how proud you must be to have such an amazing book out there, but the fact that it's been made into a film as well.
It's
Um,
pretty exciting. Yeah.
I bet it is. I bet it is. Okay, so thank you so much all for watching this. Peter, thank you so much for your time. We're obviously here with the support of Bonnier as well, the publisher here in the UK. And I haven't got the official cover. Have you got the cover there? The one the
The new one. There you
the
go.
one you're holding is the one that we're obviously doing through this book, and we've also got pin badges and postcards and signed book plates by. I trust you've been signing book plates at some point very busily, and
Yes, that's happening. Yes.
brilliant. So
Yeah,
I'll receive
those are
those.
coming. Those are coming.
Fantastic. So everyone who buys one will get pin badges and book plates and some bookmarks and all sorts. So and I've seen lots of orders coming in already. So thank you for that. Um, Further to say, Peter, thank you for your time. And obviously 9 o'clock in the morning. You've got the whole day ahead of you now.
That's right. This was a great way to start my day. So thank you all for spending some time with me this morning. This has been a lot of fun. I hope you've enjoyed my talk and my drawing, and I really hope you check out the Wild Robot books, and the film too. So there's a lot waiting
Fantastic.
for you.
Thank you, and thank you to all the children in the schools who've watched this event. Thank you so much. Bye bye.
All right. Bye, everybody.